Welcome to Where Parents Talk. My name is Lianne Castelino. Our guest today is a developmental clinical psychologist, a speaker, and an author. Meg Jay specializes in adult development with a particular focus on 20-somethings. She is Associate Professor of Human Development at the University of Virginia and a mother of two. She joins us today from Charlottesville, Virginia. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Hi, Lianne. It's great to be here.
Really interesting subject matter because we've got a lot of parents thinking about their kids who are in their 20-somethings. But let me ask you to start off our conversation. What generally are characteristics that parents need to know about when we're talking about anyone in their 20s?
I think the most important word to think about when you think about 20-somethings is the word uncertainty. That might not be characteristics of the 20-something, but that summarizes their environment, their milieu. That's what makes the 20s so amazing, but so difficult, is that they're the most uncertain years of life. And we can talk more about that. But I think really remembering that, empathizing with that, tapping into all the uncertainty that your 20-something is waking up with every day would probably help most parents a lot.
So why is uncertainty something that needs to be kept top of mind then?
Well, in the past 50 years or so, adult milestones have moved upward. So in 1970, for example, your average 21-year-old had a partner, had a baby, had a house, had a job. It's hard to imagine, I know, but that used to really be the way that it was. These days, those milestones hover more around 30 than around 20, which means you have a good 10-year period of life. And it's really usually the only decade of life where you wake up in the morning, you don't know where you'll live in 5 years, you don't know who you'll love in 5 years, you don't know where you'll work in 5 years, you don't know who your friends are, you don't know when you'll be able to pay your bills. So everything is uncertain at once. Of course, there's always parts of life that are uncertain, but it's really the only time in our lives, hopefully, where everything is uncertain at one time. And the brain really doesn't like that, and 20-somethings don't like it either.
At the same time, you believe that it is a defining decade when we're talking about the 20-something. So can you take us through and unpack what you mean by that?
Yeah, so as you know, if these adult milestones are all sort of going to start happening, especially late 20s, early 30s, they're all about to happen or starting to happen in our 20s. So I look at myself, I think, okay, well, I was married at 33, but I met my partner in my 20s. I graduated from graduate school in my 30s, but I started in my 20s. That all the things that sort of came to fruition for me and for a lot of young adults these days in their 30s, they really all start in their 20s. So, I work in the 20s because that's where all the action is. That's when people, are starting to think about, where do I want to work? Who do I want to be? Where do I want to live? Who do I want to love? How's my life going to look? And so even though that may come to fruition in the 30s, those projects are all beginning in their 20s. And it's an amazing time to work with people because I get to get in front of all these defining moments.
You've been in this space for quite some time, as you've sort of outlined there. What are some of the key trends that you're noticing with 20-somethings today that perhaps their parents did not experience? And at the same time, their parents are probably having challenges dealing with their 20-something child.
Well, I think it depends on what parents today, what their 20s were like. So for some parents today, so I have only recently become the parents of a 20-something, but my 20s were similar to the 20s today. I was in graduate school. I didn't have a partner. I didn't own a home. I mean, I really had sort of a modern 20-something life for my 20s. That said, I have clients who say, well, my parents say, well, I had met my partner at 23, and we were all settled. We don't understand all this chaos that you're dealing with. So I think some of it depends on what your experience of your 20s was like. So I think some people can maybe identify better than others with what's happening now. One thing that definitely has changed in the last 10 or 15 years is obviously technology, which has its pluses and minuses. And so I think understanding the role that technology is playing in 20-something life, both in terms of changing how the work experience is going to be, obviously changing people's social lives, dating lives, etc. That's something that's new.
So, what do you say to a 20 something that is in your office who is looking for support, who maybe has parents who had a completely different experience than them, or even the opposite, had a very similar experience? Like, what are you saying to them to reassure them about an uncertain decade in an uncertain world?
Right. So I do a lot of normalizing that there's a famous bell hooks quote, education is an intervention. And, I'm a clinical psychologist, but I would say I'm really more of a teacher than a therapist, that very few of my 20-something clients need therapy. They just often need better information. So if I have a client who says, well, I'm behind, everybody else is ahead, everybody else has it figured out, my parents had it figured out, what's wrong with me? So I hear that a lot. And then I have to say, like, well, did they? Or, and they'll say, yeah, my parents met each other at 23. And then we'll say, okay, well, let's talk about some national averages these days. So average age of finding a partner and settling down is more like 28, 29 these days. But they'll say, what's wrong with me? I don't own a home. Average age of first-time home ownership in the United States is now 35. So you're not off time for not having a home and a partner and, job stability. So I do a lot of norming around what are actually the averages today. And of course, averages are just averages. Some people are ahead, some people are behind the averages, but it does help people at least anchor themselves in their own environment or their own decade, rather than trying to compare themselves to something that happened 3 decades ago for some other people.
So I guess key to understanding for any parent about, better understanding their 20 something is to have some kind of insight into what is happening physiologically and psychologically during that decade of the 20 somethings. Could you take us through some of the high level key parts of that?
Yeah, so we talked about uncertainty, sort of established that as the air 20-somethings are breathing. So something to understand about that is that the brain interprets uncertainty as danger. So it is very common for 20-somethings to feel very anxious and stressed about their reality because it feels dangerous. It makes evolutionary sense to be worried about, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if things are going to work out. That does not mean there's something wrong with your 20-something. That does not mean that person necessarily has a mental health disorder. It just means that their brain does not like the uncertainty that they're dealing with. Another thing to understand about 20-somethings is that their brains skew negatively, more negatively than even older adults. I mean, all people skew negatively because, again, it's just more adaptive to be ready to expect the worst rather than to assume everything will always be fine. But 20-something brains skew especially negatively. So if something uncertain happens, they imagine the worst. They do a lot of what ifing and catastrophizing, worst case scenario thinking. And so a lot of my job is really to first help them understand that's what's happening. This is just a normal reaction for a young adult brain to have, and then help them shift from all the what ifs to what else, of what else could I be saying about this situation? What else might come to pass than the worst that I'm thinking? That this is truly like a reframing pivot that they just don't have a lot of experience with. And they also don't have that life experience that as a 40-year-old or a 50-year-old, something bad happens. Your brain does that. It what ifs, but then you can quickly draw on situations where you go, oh, I've been here before and it worked out, or I've been here before and I found my way through. A 24-year-old does not have that experience to draw on. They're not doing anything wrong. They just don't yet have those data points.
So then what would you say to a parent who might be guilty of catastrophizing and looking at the negatives? It's impossible.
You're not helping.
No, exactly. But it's such a hard thing today in the world we live in. I mean, if you choose not to watch TV or follow any kind of media, you're probably ahead of the rest of us.
Right.
But it's a challenge, right? So what do you say to a parent like that in order to empower them to help their 20-something?
Right. So I would say to role model the behavior they would like their 20-something to do. So, if I have a client who the minute something goes wrong, they immediately get upset and panic, and they text their parent about how upset they are. And then the parent emails me that they're really upset, that their child is upset. That's a lot of panicking going on, instead of the parent saying what I would say if they were in my office of, well, hold on, slow down. Okay, X, Y, and Z happened, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the worst thing could come to pass. What else might happen? What else could you do in this situation besides panic? So I talk to parents and 20-somethings a lot about, rather than panicking, problem solving. So what can you do about the situation rather than how can you sort of spin on panicking about it?
One of the things that you also are a proponent of is the belief that the 20s are a critical period for mental health and well-being. Why do you believe that?
Well, they're definitely a particular period for mental health and well-being. So, another thing parents can do to help their kids, speaking of sort of correcting misinformation, is please don't tell your 20-somethings that their 20s are going to be the best years of their life. Two reasons. One is, empirically speaking, that isn't true, that for all the reasons you and I have just discussed, all that uncertainty, your 20s are going to be probably, hopefully, the time of your life where you have the least money, you have the worst job, you're probably the most lonely you're ever going to be, the most uncertain, unstable, everything's changing, friendships are shifting. So it not only does it not make sense that these would be the best years of their lives, all the data show that they're not. The other reason we don't want to tell 20-somethings these are going to be the best years of their lives is because that's depressing. That what we want to sort of raise our kids to do is create lives that get better and better as they go. We don't want our kids to peak in their 20s and then think everything that follows is terrible. So that's a big piece of misinformation that I think parents could help their kids with, of saying, just normalizing a lot of the struggles. Oh, you were asking about the mental health piece. So combined with that is, they are the years of your life where you're most likely to feel depressed, you're most likely to feel anxious, you're most likely to feel stressed, and you're most likely to feel like you can't focus. So common. And I really encourage 20-somethings and their parents not to panic about these experiences, or even assume that their kid has a mental health disorder or needs a diagnosis or medication. Some do, most don't. So that's not the first place I go with a 20-something when I find out that they're having common normal struggles such as anxiety, depression, stress, lack of focus.
A lot of 20-somethings arrive into that decade increasingly today already feeling anxious before they're in their 20s, already feeling potentially depressed, whether it's clinically diagnosed or otherwise. So, how do you differentiate? Like, how does a parent know the difference?
Well, the bad news is there's no litmus test, blood test, MRI for that. The good news is I'm not sure the difference matters, because it doesn't really matter whether you call something clinical depression or I'm feeling depressed. It really, I mean, in a way, much of the treatment is the same. That whether you choose to take medication for a mental health concern, everybody needs sort of a skill-based approach as well. So that's really where I start with all of my clients. And I try not to get too hung up on whether this is a disorder or not a disorder, diagnosis, not a diagnosis. I try to find out what's going on and what do we know about what's helpful in this situation. So if it's anxiety, I'm looking at things that young adults can do to build the skills to help them when they're feeling anxious, whether that's diagnosable or not diagnosable anxiety. Same thing with depression. The number one precursor for depression in young adults is a breakup. So when someone is, just coming out of a breakup, they can probably meet criteria for DSM depression. That doesn't mean they're a depressed person. It doesn't mean they're disordered. It doesn't mean they'll always be depressed. It means they need help getting through this loss and this very sad experience. And so we work on those skills, and I try not to get too concerned with what we do or don't call it.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you as well, I mean, I think in understanding what's going on in the 20 somethings, it's also important to understand what some of the common misconceptions are among parents about kids in their 20 somethings. Can you take us through some of those?
Um, my book, The Defining Decade, probably the common misconception I'm trying to re-educate about is that 30 is the new 20. This sort of sense, I think a lot of times older people with their kids, to make them feel better, they're like, oh, you've got all the time in the world, it's all going to work out. No, I'm not saying I don't think people's lives are going to work out. I'm just saying that 20 somethings don't find that to be a useful response. That if your 20 something is feeling worried or stressed about their life or their future, their career, their relationships, rather than saying, like, oh, you got all the time in the world, that I take their questions seriously. What are you worried about? What can we do about it? So again, it's that problem solving perspective. And in a way, my other book, The 20 something Treatment, is the opposite end of that spectrum, the other unhelpful end of the spectrum of, I'm feeling worried or stressed or sad or whatever, and people panicking and saying, oh no, this is supposed to be the best years of your life. There must be something wrong with you. You must have a mental health disorder. That's probably not the case either. And so, again, I'm looking at what's got you so worried, what's got you so stressed, what is the problem that you're dealing with, what's the situation, and how do we problem solve it? So, again, with clients and with parents, I'm usually thinking about, how do we role model and teach problem solving versus panicking or worrying about pathologizing?
Let's dive a little bit more deeper into your latest book, The 20 something Treatment. What would you say was the impetus, the catalyst for you to write this book?
Well, I'm a clinical psychologist, so from the jump, I've been working with mental health issues in 20 somethings. Interestingly, when I wrote The Defining Decade, it came out, the first edition came out in 2012. I originally had a chapter in there about mental health, but this will tell you how things have changed. My editor, rightly at the time, was like, people aren't ready. That's just not, doesn't belong in a mainstream book. And he was right. He said, I think that's another book. You'll write other books, save it. And so, about 10 years later or so now, everybody's talking about mental health. People are watching TikToks about it all day long. Some of the conversations are more useful than others. So I thought now would be a good time to write that mental health book, and just share what I've learned after, at this point, 25 years of working with young adult mental health.
In the course of writing the book, there's the science piece as well, in terms of the research. Anything you uncovered in there that you think parents really need to understand?
Um, I think I would say it's the piece that I'm talking about, that rather than panicking or pathologizing, really just to help their kids problem solve. And that problem solving may include, hey, let me help you find a therapist, or hey, let's go talk to somebody about medication. I'm not saying that those things are never warranted or useful or necessary, but those are two ways to look at some of the problems. And some of the problems are, hey, let me help you figure out how to talk to your boss, or hey, maybe